Well, how about we go ahead and get started? Welcome everyone. Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending where in the world you're coming from. My name is Laura Geringer and I'm the community manager for ShapingEDU. This event is the second in our series around the teaching tool set, Bending Tools to Practice. But don't worry, you don't need to have attended the first session to get a lot out of this one. Before we dive in, one quick announcement. Our next big event is upcoming, as you can see from the spooky castle behind me. We will be gathering in July for our next unconference, which is all about reshaping wicked problems. These complex, multifaceted problems with underlying competing values should be a lot of fun. We're currently voting on which wicked problems to address in the unconference. I'll put a couple links in the chat, but it's a free event and I invite all of you to join us. So without further ado, let's kick things over to Tom, our fabulous storyteller in residence and leader of this hackathon. Hey, Tom.
Good morning, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well. And as far as the voting for the wicked problems is concerned, vote for tool sets, okay? Actually, the idea behind these connected hackathons is they are building towards something, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But the idea is that this is not just, we're not just sort of blowing smoke here. We're actually trying to build something, a guide at the end of this process that will allow us to share the insights of the collective group with a larger audience. And that's sort of the idea behind how this is coming, should hopefully come together. I mean, I know some of you may remember the old Horizon report at the New Media Consortium, and this is kind of a new take on that because we did that in a very different way back in the day with a fairly small select group within the larger NMC and used the Delphic method, which I'm sure if you've been dealing with, or if you've been doing Rubin's Black Swan stuff, you'll have some familiarity with. The idea here is to just synthesize a lot of really cool ideas and put them together and create a guide that we can give out to normals, so to speak, as we're coming up with great ideas for how we want to use those tools to use those tools to achieve our educational goals and so on and so forth. So that's sort of the game plan. Last time around, well, actually, let me go to the presentation. And I think I figured out the problem last time. I'm going to set this up a little bit. I'm not going to spend as much time setting up as last time because some of you have been there, and if you really want to see the full version, you can review the tape from last time. I encourage you to go back and take a look. I think we had some good conversations, but like everything else, you got to start somewhere and build toward the larger goal. So I don't want to. Last time on the Toolset Hackathon, let me make sure I pull up the chat window here. Usually, yeah, okay. When I go to share screen, I always forget that I always forget to pull up the chat window and stuff. I'm glad I have Laura to help me and keep track of the participants. When I do that with my students, I also have to remember to take the participant window down too, because otherwise people will drop out and drop back in. I have to let them back in. Okay, so today what we're going to talk about are asynchronous tools. The idea here is, I think, one way to think about this, and this is what I blogged about the other day on the site, is, these are all pretty much ways in which we create artifacts. These are ways in which we give our students the space and time to build their own stuff. And I think the real challenge here is to get them to a point where they're actually building something meaningful, and they're putting their part into this, creative learning process into play. Some of these can be weird and funky, like Prada Marfa. I don't know if any of you guys have ever seen or heard of this place, but this is out in the middle of nowhere, West Texas, a little town. Actually, it's not even in Marfa. It's in a town called Valentine, which is about 20 miles west of Marfa, out in West Texas, north of Big Bend. Davis Mountains are in the reflection of the window there, if that helps at all. But this is an art installation. This is not a real Prada store. This is something the guy built out in the middle of the desert just as a, conversational piece. But it's an artifact. I mean, this is something that makes people stop and go, okay, this is funky. I don't know what it means, but it's just so out of place and out of whack that, it's worth stopping and seeing. So think about, those kind of experiences and how we can build those things for our students, but also more importantly, how we can encourage our students to build those things for themselves. So this is the new toolset grid. Last time we did the top half of this grid. We did traditional and conversational. These were the synchronous tool sets. And those are all about creating the moment. And today we're going to do the bottom half of the grid. And then for the third session, we're going to do the green box. Because I think that doesn't really fit neatly within any of the other topics. And we'll talk about that in a few weeks in the next session, which is what, the 25th, I think? Yeah, okay. So today's two areas are informal and presentational. And we will divide up into groups based on those two sections, either 2 or 4 groups, depending on how many people ultimately wander in. The difference between the orange box and the blue box is distance versus not distance, physical. There's really no good word for that, right? You don't want to call it normal because especially today, it's not really normal, right? But is it physical? I say proximate, but that's not necessarily the best word for it either. So if anybody's got a really good idea for a different way to call that, that's one I've struggled with from the get-go on this whole project. And then the blue box is distant, the idea that these things are happening at a distance where you are not in the same place as your students and your students aren't necessarily in the same place as each other. So so that's how I've decided to divide them up for the purposes of this exercise. The other side of this equation is, okay, so we've got all these tools, and hopefully some people will come up with some interesting tools they can bring to the table as well. Well, what are we doing with them? And this is where I bring in Diana Laurillard, 6 Types of Learning. This comes out of her book from 2012, 2013 called Teaching as a Design Science. Don't worry, this graphic on the right side here with all of the crib notes on it is actually on the Miro board, so you can reference it at any time. And she divides up learning practice as 6 things. You're asking your students to do one of 6 things. Acquisition, which is, as she says here, reading books, listening to teacher presentations, basically one-way, conversation. Inquiry, where it can be one way, but the student is the one driving the interaction. Practicing things, getting better at it by doing it, dribbling the basketball, right? Production, making things out of various and sundry pieces of artifacts that you're picking up along the way. I think production is going to be a big part of the conversation today, actually. Discussion, people talking to each other and iterating based on having active discussions. And collaboration, which is people working together to build things together. Production is kind of a individualistic thing, so collaboration is production as a group. And I add one other thing to this, because this is not really one of her concerns in the book. She does talk about it in considerable detail, but she separates it out from these learning strategies. I think the other thing we can never lose sight of is this idea of the stimulation of curiosity, because one of the number one things I think we have a lot of problems with our students is motivation. And they're just sort of going through the motions. So I'll come back to that in a minute. So the idea behind what we're working on here, it's just the project as a whole, is to figure out how to connect the red boxes with the grid, okay? And that's really what I'm going to ask you guys to do on the Miro board. So as far as how we move through this process, what I call this is, I came up with this term a few weeks ago called digital constructivism. And the idea is that you have punctuated hackathons, live synchronous sessions like today, followed by the continuous creation of stuff in a combination of this Miro board and Google Docs. And I will give the links for both of those are in the chat. If you scroll up to the very, very top, I dropped them in there. The Miro, they're both bit.ly links, Toolset Miro board and Toolset Google Docs. By the way, that is one of the coolest things that bit.ly's added recently, the ability to create those customized bit.ly links, because you can do some good stuff with that. And surprising number of them are available. That's probably going to change. It's sort of like the early days of the internet when you can get coke.com. But for now, it's a great tool. So today's number 2. And so first of all, we did synchronous a few weeks ago on the 18th. Asynchronous is today, and 3 weeks from now on the 25th, actually 3 weeks and a day, is XR. And I'm hoping that a couple of our XR mavens will be joining us for that one. And then this is why I want you to vote for the tool sets, is that if that becomes a session in the Wicked Problems, we'll use that as a way to sort of push things all back together to collectively figure out what exactly we've created. And I'm going to be working on that in the interim too as well. But and then the idea is to come up with this guidebook by the end of the year. So that's sort of the game plan. If for some reason we don't have it during the conference, we'll have it in August sometime. Okay, so these are the 2 sandboxes. Again, there are the links. So what I'd like you guys to do first is to take a moment and go back and just sort of look at the synchronous tools for just a minute. I didn't want to do that. All right. Problems of using a magic pad. It sometimes does things by magic. Magic is bad. Go back and look at the last, if you could, go ahead and log into the board, take a look at it, and see if anything jumps out at you. It doesn't have to be particularly profound. This is it's a messy sandbox at this point, and that's okay. I did a little bit of cleaning up. It looks a little different than this screenshot, actually. Actually, I should probably just flip to the Miro board. Okay. There we go. So here's the board. Yeah. So take a moment and just take a look and see what you can see. That's cool. See you guys moving around the board like you're that's cool. All right. But what do you see? Hi, Trey. Come back next time. Watch the video. I don't know how much my mic is picking that up, but I'm sorry, but my son is running a blender downstairs. We'll be lucky if we get through the whole session without the dogs barking. So
it's not a true Zoom call without a dog barking or a kid, so you're good.
Okay. He's almost not a kid anymore, but he's got 6 more months till he hits 18. My last 2. My office is part of the game room that I've taken over, since they're not little kids anymore. They don't have the kind of, they don't use it anymore. So just some thoughts, random thoughts, put them in the chat. Doesn't have to be, again, profound. You don't have to change anything. Don't feel like you have to edit. Of course, you're welcome to. Because today what we're going to do is we're going to work on this side of the board, okay? So we'll be doing the same thing that we did over here, but over here, okay? And I know Brent's raring to go for the asynchronous tools, right? Okay. 15. Just a couple minutes. I'll shut up for a minute and let you guys look for a second. You can also mic in and say something. Please feel free to turn on your mic at any point. Yes, I know you did, Brent. I did not delete anything, I swear. I really didn't. So any thoughts? So I'm particularly interested in any sort of connections that you might see, things that you talked about in these synchronous tools and said, you know, this really needs to be partnered with an asynchronous tool for it to be truly effective. That's the kind of thing, and that's the kind of thing we'll be talking about in the fourth session. And the idea is that we come up with packages of tools and synergistic combinations. I'm going to have to figure out an interesting way to put that into the final publication. It may be a concept map of some sort to figure out how to. I mean, one of the problems, one of the challenges. I shouldn't use the word problems. Many years ago, when I was doing tech support for Apple, they said never use the word problems, always say challenges, and I thought it was a little bit of a euphemistic speak there, but okay. But one of the challenges with a lot of these concepts that I run into personally is this idea that we almost need a 3D environment to really figure out some of this stuff, to see things in a different way. And actually, they're just starting to come out with some VR concept mapping tools. We'll talk about that next time as well. And I think I'm like, yeah, sign me up. I've yet to play with them much. Actually, I don't really have any VR gear here. So, but that to me sounds like, you know, the idea that you can look at things in several different dimensions. And one of the reasons that this is kind of messy is partially because we're smashing this into 2 dimensions. So, okay. Well, if you come up with other things as you're working on this, let's do it this way then. If you come up with other things as you're working on this, then you know, drop that into the chat, and I'll add it to the presentation as some notes as well. So I will be building, altering, and adjusting the presentation as we go along. So that's the page intentionally left blank for your brilliance. Okay. All right. So let me set up the groups here then, and we'll split up into our into them. So how many participants are we running at right now, Laura? How many are here?
We've got 19, so perfect for 2 groups.
2 groups, excellent. All right. So here's some things to think about. And these are kind of some of these things I've also talked about in in the blog the other day, which are, you know, think about how do you use asynchronous tools to connect synchronous sessions like we're doing right now. I mean, this idea of a living document in Google or Miro or other kinds of tools to sort of create something that provides a continuity between, you know, say class sessions, for instance, or in this case, you know, workshop sessions, but also gives them that sense of building something, right? So, you know, a lot of times students walk into class as a one-shot deal. You know, you walk in, the teacher drones at you for 45 minutes to an hour, and then you walk back out, and then you sort of check that chapter off, and then you go on to the next one, and then you know, the only continuity you have is when you have to somehow put it together in a test, right? So how can we use the tools to make that progression more explicit? How can we make meaningful assignments using these tools? You know, I was actually up visiting my parents the other day, and, you know, going through the house, they live in Cleveland. It's my first trip in a year and a half. But going through the house and seeing the artifacts that they have picked up over their 80 some odd years of life, and the meaning that's attached to them, because they're meaningful to me, of course, because they're, you know, pictures of me and my brother when we were little kids and stuff like that. And oh yeah, I remember that, and I remember that experience. So, you know, this is what I talked about in the blog, this idea of connecting an artifact with something that's meaningful. How can we figure out how to do that with our students, instead of the usual do a paper and walk away? And then that directly ties into this idea of motivating our students, and how do we get them to provide, to give some real creative energy as opposed to just checking the boxes, in terms of, you know, getting through the class, because that's what we're really looking for, that deeper connection. And then there's another part that, you know, you may not think this fits in, and that's the informal spaces box. But think about what happens in those informal spaces. I mean, we create meaning there too. And if you think back on your college or your school experiences, I will virtually guarantee you that you're more likely to remember stuff that happened outside the classes, where you're hanging out with people, you're discussing things, you're building that, you know, you're contextualizing things, you're making new friends, you're creating relationships. But it's still tied back to that college, that quote unquote college experience. So those those informal spaces are also tools for creating meaningful artifacts in a sense of memories. So think about how those things can be used again to this connective tissue between the live sessions. So without further ado, let me pull out of so without further ado, okay, stop. How do I get out of it? All right. Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and divide up into groups. Oh, there it is. All right. I'm operating on too little sleep today, so where did I stop the share? It's right there. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and split up. You'll either be in the tan box group or in the blue box group. Don't feel horribly constrained by that, but I'd like it to sort of frame what you're working on. If for some reason you have a thing of, oh, I really want to put something over here, don't hesitate, just do it. But the idea is to have that conversation and say, okay, how do we connect up that list of tools? And there's an option also to create additional tools that obviously I may have left off the list. So let's go ahead and divide up into the two groups, and I will see you guys in one of the groups, and I will visit the second one too.
Welcome back, everyone. Looks like some great work happening in the breakouts. Tom, you are auto-muted.
Auto-muted, thank you. No, I'm not. And I apologize in advance for not being muted. Yeah, so we decided to come back together a little bit early. The interesting thing that seems to be happening with the Moreau a little bit in the discussions that we've been having is that there does seem to be a little bit of a bleed between the two groups, which seems to be a bigger thing than it was in the last session, in the sense of people kind of jumping back and forth between the two. And it's not just Brent, who's a known troublemaker. Just kidding, Brent. But yeah, this is good. I mean, you know, there's always this tug of war between models that help simplify and explain things and the reality that life is messy. And so that's fine. And in the sense of having a organic document, you're going to get the messy. So please feel free to be messy to the extent that I can. My job is to sort of figure out the messy and align it to something that makes sense as much as possible. And then maybe have a group that is like, okay, this is so messy, we may just have to make a separate category for it, right? Does not fit neatly into any bucket. But I also think that a lot of this is going to ultimately, nobody uses these tools in isolation. I mean, that's the reality of it, right? So we're kind of deconstructing now. So that fourth session will be reconstructing. And so that's, and come up with synergistic and sets of tools that create learning environments that, you know, make us think about how we're doing this so one of the things that, you know, I'm definitely trying to get away from, and we talked a little bit about this in the first group, is this idea that, you know, a lot of times we go out and somebody sells us on a tool and they say, oh, well, it'll do these great things. And then you give it to faculty or you use it yourself and you discover, well, it does those great things, but they don't really align with the tasks that I'm trying to do. And maybe I need to change my tasks, but the reality is that, as Laurel Art talks about, you know, the tasks that we do in the classroom kind of break down into these categories. And so, yes, maybe you need to say, okay, well, this is a tool that's good for practice, but it's not good for collaboration. That's fine, but we need to be we're trying to understand what these tools are forcing us to do, or more importantly and appropriately, to look at what these tools have the capacity to open doors for us to do, right? So, real quick again, and I said this in earlier as well, and I hate to repeat myself, but if you can tag your, you know, especially these thought bubbles and stuff, if you wrote it, please put your name on it just in case, so that I can figure out who's who. If I need to get, you know, say, okay, we need some more clarification. You may not be in the later meetings. I hope to see everybody again, but obviously we have busy, complicated schedules, and so I can certainly attest to that myself. But I'm still naively optimistic that we can deconstruct. Yes. Oh, thank you, Laura, for reminding me. Yes, in the Google Doc, if you are here today, please put if your name isn't already on the list at the beginning of that Google Doc, please make sure you put your name and contact info on there as well. You know, at the end of the day, I want to make sure everybody who contributed to this process gets credit in the booklet. So I can't guarantee it'll make you famous. I will try really hard not to make you infamous, but I do want to make sure that is there a bonus Zoom point for shattered class cleanup? Ooh.
Just because every Zoom call has kids and dogs, but
oh,
you know,
I thought
mine had a shattered coffee cup. So
okay, so you did have a catastrophe.
A little bit. Had to, you know, get it cleaned up before kids or dogs hit it, because you know, it's a whole different mess.
Is it carpet, or at least not carpet at least, or did you know?
Oh, it was on tile.
Okay, well that's at least a little easier to clean up.
It is, yeah. So apologies for the absenteeism, but back now.
I have one complaint, that we didn't get the sound effect of everything's just smashing. That would have been cool.
That would have been really cool. It sounded awesome.
You got to get something out of it. Okay. So, you know, this is kind of the little bit of free play hour, but a few minutes here. Thanks, Eric, for playing along. If you want to take this time to drop some things into the other group, if you haven't already done so, like Brent, then feel free to do so. I don't want to limit anyone on that, on what they contribute to. In general, I you know, agree with that. So what did you guys think? Did you have any epiphanies? Did anybody see something that somebody else put in and going, oh, okay, that's like what I'm doing or close to what I'm doing, but could, you know, it may be better if I did it this way. Any thoughts there?
I'm wondering if there are other tools that should be linked, tools or examples that should be linked to curiosity. Because I see currently we only have one going from the right-hand side of the diagram down to curiosity.
Yeah, you're right. There's not that many from the other side either. On the asynchronous or the synchronous tools.
And I don't know if that's because it's the last one on the list, and so it was just overlooked by its position on the image, or if we need to do some more thinking about how these tools relate to curiosity.
So let me ask you guys a question related to that as well, is in terms of your own curiosity, as you were doing this, and I should have watched this a little more carefully, did you start with the teaching practice and then connect a tool to it, or did you typically start with a tool and connect it to a teaching practice? Just curious in terms of your own pathways to looking at this. Started with tool, okay.
I started with tool.
Okay, yeah. I don't think that's atypical. I think that a lot of times we want to start with a tool. And part of this learning journey is to sort of think about, you know, when I rebuilt my class a few years ago, and as I've gradually iterated it over time, I typically have started with a task and say, okay, I want my students to be able to do this, and we're operating under these constraints. So in the olden days, our constraints were we were all sitting in a particular kind of room. Maybe the chairs didn't move, or maybe the chairs did move, or the tables moved, and you could reconfigure, you know, depending on the room. How do I get to them doing these kinds of activities in that space? But you know, but I need them to do a simulation, let's say, okay, and they, you know, and I want them to be able to group up in groups of, you know, 10 people each or 6 people each, and spread out through the room, and then have a way of sharing that across the room. How can I use that? You know, how can I use what's available to me? And as I've gone through, I've kind of gone on a macro level of this and say, okay, over the course of the semester, these are the things I want my students to practice and to try over the semester. These are the things I want them to produce over the semester to demonstrate the skills that they've acquired through practice and iteration. And the best way to do that is to use these sets of tools, right? So for instance, you know, writing a paper is a tool. And unfortunately, I think Lisa's had to leave, but she was talking in her group about using PowerPoint. But the thing that struck me there was, okay, when they do a PowerPoint, they submit it directly to her through the assessment assignment tool. That's a very different environment or different experience than having them create a public PowerPoint and share it with the whole class, or presentation where, you know, it get dropped. Either there's multiple ways you can do this. You could use Prezi and share it or something like that, or you could, you know, create it in a more traditional format and turn it into a slide that you can maybe drop. Not every, well, let me rephrase that. I'm not sure if every LMS discussion tool will let you do that inside the context of the tool itself. But the idea is that put it in a discussion rather than using the assessment tool. You can still grade them that way, but everybody can see it. And then you can start a process of conversation around that particular artifact that they've created. Whether that, and so one of the things that I did from the get-go is I said, I want everybody writing in public. I don't want, it's stupid for them to just write for me. They need to learn to write for an audience, and the audience, at least initially, was the rest of the class. But as over the course of the semester, they're building a public website, which is theoretically open to anyone who cares to look at it, or that they can share with anyone, whether they're in the class or not. So, you know, thinking about the task that I want them to do, you know, again, public writing, where they learn to comment on each other's stuff, where they learn to have these conversations, where they learn to iterate based on the feedback that they're getting, not just from me, but also from the other students. That's the task I wanted. So the only way I could do that was to use a blog tool of some sort, right? Now, what I ended up doing when we moved online is I used the discussion tool in Canvas, which is our LMS, to create, I allow them to create their own discussions, and they write their blogs as a new discussion post, and everybody can see it in the class. The public website is still the public website at the end of the semester, and we work on that iteratively over the semester, building it piece by piece, building drafts and so on and so forth. But then that creates that public learning process. You know, learning is both private and public at the same time. But it really makes a difference if everybody's sort of looking and saying, hey, you know what? He's making the same mistake I am, or she's making the same mistake I am. And, you know, maybe or this person's figured it out. So let me talk to them and figure out how to do this, right? So anything you can do to facilitate those kind of conversations. Excuse me. So, what kind of, anybody else have some thoughts or things that went, oh, okay, if I think about this way, how does that change how I approach my tools? So I assume some of you guys are active teachers, or at least helping active teachers. You know, what's that one task in class that always seems to fail? Because for whatever reason that you can't seem to get it to work right, or the students don't cooperate. Everybody has those. As a matter of fact, I don't have one task, I have a list.
So I do a lot in teams, and
Mhm.
it is amazing to watch how some flourish and
Mhm.
some just don't. I mean, I have had some that they just fight each other left and right.
Yeah.
And fight the process. For a disclaimer, I'm teaching in an organizational leadership degree program where they are leaders in training.
Right. You already have a pre-selected audience there that should be good at this.
Well, not necessarily good at it, but at least open to doing it.
Right.
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 And I always switch things up, and I change things and stuff like that. And it's a very contentious course, and either you love it or you hate it, and I'm okay with that. And the same goes with whether they love or hate me. What I do know is 5 years from now, they'll all go, oh, I get it now.
Right. So
And
one question for you, as far as the teams working or not, what kind of tools do you think you could apply, maybe ones that you haven't yet, that might change the dynamic of that and make that less contentious?
So one of the contentious pieces, just to clarify, is the fact that our classes are 7.5 weeks or sometimes 6 weeks long.
Right.
So that is definitely part of it.
Are you saying that's too short or too long?
Too short.
Okay.
Because on day 3, after the drop add date, I'm creating teams, and they have a first assignment due in a week. So there's not a lot of time. So I introduce a lot of stuff in terms of culture building and trust, and hey, you just got to jump into it. I give them, the tools and ideas to, do icebreakers, and I give them some ideas for that. I offer to meet with them. They have, a discussion board that they can start to get to know each other. They have their own discussion boards in Canvas, of course. I use Perusal so they can also start meeting each other there and collaborating. And I have them do a charter. So that's like their first assignment, is what are your expectations of each other? And I let them decide, like, what are you going to do if there's non-participation?
Right. I want to echo Marissa's question there. Do you populate the teams, or do they form their own?
I populate them because they don't know each other enough within those 3 days to do it. Some of them aren't there yet. And because I do also have non-majors in the class, I separate them out so they are not all grouped together. and I try to even out teams a little bit, you know,
Right.
and I mean, I do randomization, and then I go through and I look at majors and I separate the majors. I try to do better in terms of what appears to be, because I cannot be sure by name alone whether or not they are men or women.
Mhm.
But because I have seen when I just actually had a team that they called themselves Diversity Divas and a Dude. And boy, were they divas. They lived up to their name. Every single one of them, right?
Yeah.
So,
Well, I have the same problem in my classes. I divide my groups up into effectively design teams that go through the whole semester together. And I have the same challenges as far as how do I do that, and how I use the teams themselves in terms of the tools, et cetera. For instance, and one thing I'm going to have an interesting challenge next week with my classes because or my class, it's a 2.5 hour class on Zoom, and I know for a fact that I'm not going to be able to hold their attention for 2.5 hours on Zoom. It's just not going to happen. So what I'm going to do is some combination, and I did this in the regular semester when I only had to worry about an hour and a half. I had each team meet for 40 minutes of the class, and then I went to the other team, and I was there the whole time, but each team met synchronously with each other, and then we worked together, you know, and modeled behavior and so on and so forth. As a you know, I kind of tried to be a team leader and creative juicer and so on and so forth around that. But in terms of sorting the teams, something here's kind of a wacky thought. Why not use a concept map software as a way of accelerating this? Have people put in maybe some characteristics about themselves. I have a thing that I do, which, and I don't do this on a concept map, but it occurs to me that I might want to. I have a thing on my I have a special discussion which I call the sorting hat exercise, and basically I ask them a series of questions, and these are in many ways kind of personality questions, but also interest questions, so that I can sort of try to align people around interests, so that they're all kind of working on similar challenges in the group, because everybody does their own challenge, but the idea is the group supports the broader initiative around that. But I could see doing this in a concept map and having it. I'm just watching you guys float around Miro here, you know, thinking about that as a, you know, as a lot. It would be kind of fun as a live exercise, but then maybe not finish that way, but at least start that way, and then that gives you some tea leaves you can read as you say, look, we're going to do this. This is not how you're going to pick the team, but this is going to help me figure out which team to put you on, and then you do the final sort. But then they see in a larger sense, they have a visualization of where the class lies on certain things, and it comes down to what kind of questions.
I think it's interesting if you have more time.
Well, I think you could do this pretty quickly, though. So you come up with the questions.
But here's the thing: it's an asynchronous class. They don't have to meet. I can't force them to meet.
Right.
It's hard enough to get them to do a welcome quiz that will open the class, so that they can see their assignment. And adding this with it, and adding. So I mean, I hear you. I think it's a great idea, but to add this because of how many assignments we have to get through in order to look at strategic planning.
Right. No, I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to, and that was just one idea, but
no, I like the idea if I have 15 weeks.
Right. So your task is you have a task to form these teams, and then how can you think about using different kinds of tools to help you form those teams instead of starting with a tool and saying, well, I've got the LMS, I have to use it. Instead say, well, maybe what I need to do doesn't really work within the context of the LMS, and I need to go to a web tool of some sort that's outside the LMS. But since it's not really part of the grading structure, I don't care, right? Or something like that. I mean, I'm not saying to use Miro or to use a concept mapping software. I like doing that. That's one of my biases. People are probably, who know me well, are probably laughing, going, "Oh, there goes Tom with his concept maps again. They're a solution to everything." But I like them because they help me contextualize things, and like we're doing right now, right? But in terms of sorting people, context is everything. And if you can somehow trick them into giving you some details about their personality, and over time you may learn it from experience, I don't want to put this kind of personality in a group with this kind of personality. kind of thing.
There's a lot. Yeah, there's
And
a
if it's
lot
a
that goes
management
along with
training
it.
thing, you could
What's
actually
that?
turn that into a teaching moment too, a teaching exercise, and say, look, you're going to have teams just like you guys. You're going to have teams that you're going to
Oh, I
have to
do that.
somehow
No, I do that all the time.
put together and say,
That's
what have you learned from your team experience about, how not to put people together, right?
I tell them the learning is not the book. The learning is what you do in your teams and applying what you're learning to be strategic. So we'll let somebody else bring up their idea.
Yeah, sure. No. Anybody else? Any thoughts in terms of tasks that you're trying to accomplish that you can't seem to get there? And maybe coming up, thinking about how some of these tools might help you. I mean, my teaching innovation, going back to the very beginning, is a product of immense frustration. And, it's, if you, a burr in the saddle is an understatement. And I mean, I was always changing things, and to some things were a lot bigger. Some changes were a lot bigger than others. Some were changes because I got bored with doing it the old way and I wanted to try something, a new way of doing it. But most of the time the changes were because I wasn't getting the effect that I wanted to. I remember the very first time I taught government, I decided I wanted to do an iterative process, and I wanted to do a lot of short papers so that I could, we could make adjustments over the semester. And I did 11 papers over the semester, and they were real short papers, but there were 11 papers. And I, within a couple of semesters, discovered that there's a point where that plateaus. After about 4 or 5 papers, it's not going to get any better. I mean, they get bored with it for whatever reason. It just doesn't seem to grow after that point. So then then it was a question of iterating the tool of the papers down to 5, and maybe saying, okay, how do we make the grades and all the other stuff work with that in the context of the class? And what I ended up doing for a long time was I had 5 papers, but I would drop 4 as long as you made at least a D on, you gave it the old college try on a paper. I would drop one of the 5 and do the 5 highest, scores. That gave people a chance to have a bad day, right? So any other thoughts about, unfulfilled tasks and frustrations that you might want to see addressed? It's a quiet group. Well, everybody's in this. It's a quiet hackathon. This is a good example of how the tool, now we're talking about synchronous tools, which was the last hackathon, but how the tool changes those dynamics of interaction. If we were sitting around in a room putting Post-it notes on a board, it would be a different experience, right? And I think, although I have had very quiet workshops like that too, the Zoom does certain things, and other than Laura, everyone else is a static image at this point. So that, and that's true in most of my classes, right? And also we're at the end of, we've done 80 of the 90 minutes, and everybody's kind of going, okay, I'm done. Let's go get some lunch, right? It's depending on your time zone. Okay, so, and now I'm sure Laura has a couple of closing announcements as well, but let me go back to the presentation here real quick and sort of looking forward a little bit where we're going with this. And okay, first of all, one thing that's key in this process is we're not done here. We're not done here in the sense of the overall project, but if you come back tonight and you still want to mess around on the Bureau board, it's there, right? So you can continue to play with this asynchronously. So you can go have lunch and then or sleep on it, and then tomorrow morning when you're brilliant again. I'm brilliant in the morning, so You know, that's, and after about 1 or 2 o'clock, I turn slowly into a vegetable over the course of the day. But some other people are brilliant at 3 a.m. or brilliant at midnight. So whatever works for you, you can address the asynchronous part, the asynchronous tool here, at any time or place. And that applies to both the Google Doc and the Miro Doc. These will stay open for the duration of the project. I'll probably lock them down sometime in late August or in sometime in August when I start to try to figure out how to turn this into a usable product. Exactly, Jenna. Yeah, asynchronous work, and that's true for our students as well. Of the advantage, that's the advantage. The disadvantage is that for those of us, and now I'm talking about probably 99% of the population who are procrastinators, it means that our best time is always tomorrow. Okay, so let me go back to here. And so we've already done that. So this is where we're going from here. Next one, and Laura put this in the chat. Thank you, Laura. Is on June the 25th. We're going to talk about XR. And the reason XR is a separate category is I think it kind of bends and breaks a lot of these notions of time. Potentially, you know, if Ruben and I were talking in his group about these blurry lines. The lines in XR, I think, are going to get really blurry, especially if you couple it with some sort of AI component. You know, am I really talking to somebody synchronously, or is you know, can I have a kiosk in my XR environment that's there, but at the same time, and maybe a real person at certain times, and it may be, you know, AI responses, those kind of things. I mean, we're not there yet. The other reason I put XR in a separate place is that the first 2 hackathons are about things that we all kind of know and love at a certain level. We've been dealing with these tools for 20 years, depending on the tool. Longer if we're talking about things like blackboards and whiteboards and chairs and mobile furniture and stuff like that. That's going back 100 years. XR is still somewhat theoretical. I mean, the number of institutions that are systematically implementing XR at this point is pretty small, and people are still trying to figure out the logistics of making this happen. You know, do I use this tool or do I use that tool? How do I get headsets to my students? All of those kinds of questions. Do I have to have a lab? Is it going to be segregated? You know, how do we do this, right? So these are going to be part of that discussion as well. You know, how do we start thinking about these not only as tools and, you know, as problems that lead us to questions around tools, but also as maybe how do we build these systems so that they're accessible to the widest group of students? Because that's a big part of our mission here at ShapingEDU as well. So that's about what I've got. Actually, that's a slide, an old burner slide. Laura, off to you. Thank you, everybody, for your
Wonderful.
continued work.
Just to echo Tom, thank you so much for joining us today. For instance, in July, where we'll be working with some of the wicked problems that need addressing. And of course, we'll be building our skills in dealing with the unknown. So working on developing our Black Swan thinking skills, our anti-fragility to move beyond being resilient in the face of chaos to coming out better on the other side. And we'll have a lot of fun too. So you are all invited to our haunted, spooky remote it's a remote event in July. You can register online. And until next time, keep dreaming, doing, and driving. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye.